Welcome to Life After Philosophy, where I interview former students about philosophy's effect on their lives. I'm Christopher Annandale. Welcome to Life After Philosophy. My guest today is Father Chiedozie Ononuju, known to one and all as Dozy. Father Dozy was born in Nigeria. He came to the United States during his senior year in high school. He has earned bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering from Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. While he was in college, he felt the call to the Catholic priesthood and entered the Mount St. Mary's Seminary in 2017, where he studied philosophy for 2 years. I was one of his teachers. He graduated from the Mount St. Mary's Seminary in 2023 and was ordained to the Catholic priesthood last month. He is currently associate pastor at St. Patrick's Parish in Carlyle, Pennsylvania, and Catholic chaplain at Dickinson College, also in Carlyle. Father Dozy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Annandale. It's great to be here, and thank you for your lovely introduction. Appreciate it.
Great. I appreciate you taking the time to be here. I would especially like to hear from you about the perspective you have on the philosophy formation that you've gone through in seminary. People who've listened to previous episodes of this podcast have heard that the formation program for Catholic priests begins with 2 years of philosophy study, 30 to 36 credit hours of philosophy, sort of automatic philosophy major, prior then to going through 4 years of theology study that ends with ordination to the priesthood and the beginning of a life of sacramental and pastoral ministry. Looking at it right now as somebody who's just starting out, who's just been ordained and taken up duties serving the people of God, what do you see as the relevance or the perspective that you have on the kind of philosophy and the way that you studied philosophy at the beginning of your seminary career?
One of the beautiful things that philosophy has been able to help me with is my preaching, especially just to be able to distill certain concepts in a simple way and in a way that's relatable, and also to to distill those complex concepts and explain them in a way that people can relate to, and see how the gospel also uses those philosophical concepts and to draw those out. An example would be a homily I gave as a deacon when I talked about how God is outside of time. So God sees everything as an eternal now. And that's from something I learned from St. Augustine during our medieval philosophy course, because St. Augustine, I believe it was in the Confessions, he was ruminating and talking about, what is time, and going back and forth between this great question that has puzzled so many. And then he realizes, and then he goes all the way back to creation and says, what was happening, what was there when or before God created the world, what was happening? And he comes to the conclusion that there was no before because there was no time. Like, time came about with the creation. So that's something, even as a kid, I had thought about, like, what was there before God created the world? But just realizing that there was no before or after until God created, that was very mind-blowing and mind-boggling for me. So then realizing that God sees everything as now and as an eternal now, seeing that our lives are kind of brought into that God's sight, God's view of everything as now. So that's one thing, to be able to explain that to people so that they see, like, okay, our actions are not, God is not waiting to react to what we're doing, because God is outside of time. And in that way, he sees everything all at once. So that also comes with its difficulties when you talk about the problem of evil and how do we pray and how do our prayers change things. But that's another complex question, which requires more philosophy and definitely a lot more theology. But just seeing how those concepts can be parsed out and teased out in preaching, but also in conversation when people ask about questions, big questions like that, in terms of counseling or informal conversations. So that's been very helpful to me, just preaching and speaking with people about the divine attributes and God's action in time, but
Mhm.
also realize that is outside of time. Just to give one example.
Oh, that's very good. Thank you. I wonder, some people, when they think of philosophy, they think of really two things. They think of logic and ethics. And those
Mm-hmm.
same people may also, when they think of religion, think primarily of ethics, think, advice about behavior and what to do. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, we do study philosophical ethics in the curriculum and in really any philosophy curriculum. But I
Mm-hmm.
wondered, you've mentioned some elements kind of metaphysics and of thinking about, God and time. Are there
Mm-hmm.
any other areas of philosophy other than that one and ethics, a sort of obvious one, that
Mm-hmm.
you've seen some relevance in, either in preparing for or sort of engaging in the kind of ministry that you've been called to?
Yeah, definitely with logic, which you taught me. I think that was my first philosophy class.
Yeah.
The ability to have arguments in a reasonable and you know in a reasonable fashion and in a convincing manner has been helpful to me. And I've seen this when people will bring up questions about the Bible or about the faith or even against the faith or against the Bible, and just trying to help them see that the Bible is eminently reasonable, but even beyond reason, and also helping them see that those objections they're bringing are not tenable, they're not sustainable. But just with the structure of an argument, the major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion, trying to see like how things follow from one another. Because sometimes someone will say something like, you know, one person did this, therefore all Christians are like this, or like, you know, one person did this, therefore all priests are like this. So that's reasoning from a particular to the general. That's like an unnecessary generalization, or I don't know the exact logical term, but false, I guess, false generalization. So
Right.
things like that, being able to see those and spot those more easily than
Hmm.
I would ever have prior to taking philosophy has been a huge blessing for me. So that's just one area in terms of logic. And but then the other so it's one thing to understand those concepts, but then the other step, big step to take is then translating it into language that people can understand. Because if you say you're reasoning from a false generalization, or you're that's the fallacy of the ad hominem, they're gonna be like, what are you talking about, but to be able to to explain that to people the way they understand, and in the common parlance has been
Hmm.
a blessing of the seminary formation program at the Mount. So
Yeah.
I think that, yeah, that's two steps: understanding the concepts but being able to translate them. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. I
Mhm.
wonder, and I don't want to, I don't want to give offense, but I'm thinking of a charge that might sometimes be made against very new priests, young,
Mhm.
enthusiastic priests fresh out of seminary.
Right.
One charge that one might hear from sympathetic laity is that they tend to be too academic, too intellectual. They're still thinking about, what I heard my seminary professor say, like, so what the
Mhm.
sort of the correct, textbook answers are. I'm wondering if in terms of philosophy, you found that some of that maybe kind of, classroom enthusiasm isn't tempered by the pastoral formation that you've gone through in the study of theology. I wonder, what does philosophy look like through the lens of 4 years of theology study that you've done since then? And how has that sort of helped you both in being a better priest, maybe also in being a better communicator of philosophical truths to your people?
That's a really good question, and it's not one that can be answered simply or in one way. But I think one of the things, one of the ways to answer that, as you alluded to, was being able to, again, because as a priest, one of my main jobs is to preach the gospel. So preaching the gospel is not just saying what the dogma or what the gospel is, but saying it in a way that strikes the heart of the people, strikes the heart of those who you're speaking with. So we talk about ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos is this person who's speaking, is he or she trustworthy? And then pathos is how do you appeal to the emotions? And then finally the logos is like the logical argument. So I think the seminary prepares us well for the logos part, especially the philosophy department, the logical argument. But then when we get to theology, but especially when I went on pastoral formation experiences, like being in the parish, teaching a class of, seventh and eighth graders, no matter how much I explain the philosophy concepts to them, if I don't explain it in a way they understand, that's not going to be helpful to them. So it's about what is helpful. How do I teach people the truth in a way that's helpful? But also, how do I communicate it to them in a way that they won't forget? So that's where analogies and similes and stories and other helpful tools come in. So yes, I have seen firsthand where not even just new seminarians, but also just priests who have been priests for a while, like communicate things that are true, but maybe communicate them in a way that is not as helpful or as striking. So that's one thing I try with God's grace to, overcome or avoid.
Right. Well, there's no prize for being right if you're not able to persuade people and meet them and get the truth to them in a format
exactly,
they need.
exactly. So so the theological studies helped a lot with that, but more so with just the practical aspect of being in a parish, either as a deacon or as a seminarian, talking to people one on one, and then you have the benefit of them responding to you directly versus you don't have to go back to your room and say, okay, how would I formulate this argument? Like you have to respond on the spot. So that's a big challenge too. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like maybe it's a particular way of being a philosopher, of being, a man of truth in both the sort of natural reason sense and then also in the higher, more significant sense of being a man of the gospel and an alter Christus in the case of a priest.
Right.
There's a sort of tension here, of course, between the kind of academic study, which we associate with formal schooling, classrooms, professors, and then what you've just mentioned, right? The sort of, the pastoral ministry, the speaking to people, meeting them where they're at, responding to their questions in real time as
Right.
best you can. I wonder if we approach it from the other direction, would we say that maybe uniquely in the case of Catholicism, but perhaps in general, there's a need for a certain kind of baseline of philosophical, I don't want to say savvy necessarily, wisdom, if not formal education. People need to grasp philosophical concepts about reality using their natural reason as part of their life of faith. The life of faith can't be a kind of free-floating thing that simply involves trust in God and belief in revelation. Without getting into a lot of theology about, different types of Christianity, Catholic and non-Catholic, does that seem accurate to you? Is there a certain kind of, minimum level of philosophical understanding that's required of the modern believer?
I would say absolutely. Just even studying the Nicene Creed and going through the creed, just I mean, the big one is consubstantial, right? So
Right.
Jesus is consubstantial with the Father. Well, what does that mean? Well, Jesus is of the same being as the Father. Okay, like they have the same nature. So when that is explained to someone, they have to understand to a certain degree what a nature is and what to be of the same nature with someone is. So that's like a basic philosophical knowledge that's required of the ordinary believer. Like, there's the word consubstantial is not in the Bible. However, like that truth is in the Bible, and then the Christians have to sort of subscribe and profess and assent to that. But just in general too, understanding like the whole is greater than you know the part, each individual part, for example, or various philosophical maxims like the law of non-contradiction.
Right.
So which also plays a part to understanding like God does not contradict himself, but then we also have to understand the other side of the coin, which is theological paradoxes. Like,
Mhm.
okay, God is both divine and human, and Mary is both virgin and the mother. How does that work? If the law of non-contradiction is maintained, so that's when it comes to the part of mystery, divine mysteries, and how God penetrates into our lives and into the world. So yes, there are definitely basic philosophical requisites for any Christian believer. But then but when it comes to faith, then we have to even go beyond philosophy, because faith builds on philosophy and doesn't obliterate it, but it goes beyond that, and ultimately it's a gift. So
Right.
yeah.
Very good. It seems in some ways that part of what's at stake here are the kind of the maybe what we might call the intellectual demands of the life of faith, if not perhaps for everybody, at least maybe for the ordinary believer.
Right.
Sort of we're called to meet a certain natural challenge as well as a certain supernatural and faith challenge in our overall lives of faith. And that does seem to cut against what I might call, if I'm editorializing a little bit, a kind of anti-intellectualist trend in
Mhm.
American society, a feeling that, things that require some brain work are to be regarded with a bit of suspicion. And maybe
Mhm.
especially for some people, the life of faith should involve the love of God, but it shouldn't get too confusing. It shouldn't get too metaphysical. It maybe sort of owes something to Immanuel Kant's statement in Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone,
Mhm.
that the affirmation of these very abstruse metaphysical doctrines shouldn't be part of the content of religion. Kant really seems to want to make religion a matter just purely of ethics and of
Mhm.
having a good heart.
Right.
What's you're just starting out on your priestly ministry, but do you have any ideas about strategies for dealing with that, with people who come and say, look, church shouldn't be confusing, loving God shouldn't involve brain work, should involve, love.
Mhm.
How would you approach that for somebody who begins with a kind of stance of hostility or suspicion towards that kind of intellectual demanding work?
That's a really good question again, and I have to think about that for a second. But I think one of the things would be to bring in again analogies, and that's the way I try to generally explain such things to people. Because you think about anything that's good, for example, an occupation, being a teacher, being a mechanic, being an engineer, being a doctor requires intellectual work. And these things are rewarding and these things are very important for our lives. But more so is faith, the life with God, more so, it's even more so rewarding and more important. So that should require at least some effort, for some intellectual effort for the believer. It doesn't mean the believer has to become a professional theologian, but the believer, part of putting your heart into loving God is wanting to know God more and knowing who He is and what He has said about Himself, which requires some reading, some conversation with people who are deeply in love with Him and who know Him personally and have learned about Him both by study and by experience. And that requires some effort of going out of ourselves to try to know God more. And by knowing Him more, we love Him more, and vice versa. So it's not an either or. Like, this is all about the heart, because with the heart, the head also has to be involved as well.
That's fantastic. That's a great answer. I like that very much. It puts me in mind of the thinking about the statement that you should love God with your whole heart and with your whole mind, which means
Right.
also taking responsibility to develop your mind so you can love Him with your mind more
Exactly.
and with all
Exactly.
your strength and et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
That's very good. Did you have any advice for somebody who perhaps is beginning, either in the propedeutic year or in the first year of studying seminary philosophy? Somebody testing a vocation. There are many things that go into testing a vocation, but somebody might struggle with philosophy or be skeptical about the value of philosophy. Having
Right.
been through it and now being where a lot of men who are entering seminary are sort of visualizing themselves in the first year of priestly ministry, what might
Mhm.
be your advice to them? To what sort of attitudes should they take to approaching the study of philosophy, especially if they find it intimidating or challenging?
I would say, and this question kind of dovetails nicely with the previous one. I First of all, I'd say do not be afraid. It can look intimidating, especially if you haven't done this before. But think about when you first went to college, like some of those classes were also intimidating, or when you tried to learn an instrument or try to learn something new. Anything new, if you just go into it, it'll look intimidating. But the once you try to be at peace and put your mind at peace and go gradually step by step, it will start to make sense. So that's one thing. Just don't give up because on the first try it doesn't click, you know. And then, but the corollary to that is then put in the effort and put in you have to want to know this, and you have to want to learn more about why things make sense and how we can make logical arguments, but also the order of reality, because that's something we encounter day by day. How is reality ordered, and how do things fit together? Because that's part of what philosophy studies. So I'd say yes, don't be afraid, but also make the effort and work with your professors, but also other students who have a grasp of the material to try to advance more. But ultimately, philosophy is from the name, the love of wisdom. So if you love wisdom, then you should seek to grow further into the depths of wisdom, and it requires effort. Like every good thing, every good field of endeavor requires some effort and some training to be able to master it. So yeah, that's what I would say.
It's fantastic. Thank you. Good advice. Let me ask
Mhm.
you one final question. Something that I only learned about you recently is that you have multiple degrees in electrical engineering.
Mhm.
How do you evaluate, sort of in your mind, in your memory now, your study of philosophy and theology against your study of electrical engineering? Were they similar, different, one more
Yeah.
difficult than the other, or one more fulfilling than the other? Because that's a pretty broad range of
Mhm.
formal education that you've had at your young age.
Yes. The study of electrical engineering helped my philosophical study in a very particular way. It helped me in the study of logic. I think just doing all these calculations and studying electrical engineering forces you to think really logically, like this follows from this, y follows from x, etc. So I found logic very refreshing, and you know it came to me just like that. It was almost like second nature, the study of logic. And so that helped me with that. Electrical engineering helped with philosophy in that way. And I would say just the skills I learned from studying electrical engineering, being able to put in effort into something that's worthwhile and something that's good and rewarding, to persevere even when things get difficult, that helped me in my philosophical studies, but just my studies in seminary in general. The one thing that was obviously the fields themselves are vastly different, uh, but engineering, we don't write many papers and have to. So that required a new sort of skill to develop. Writing a paper and making your arguments cogent, and having to identify a thesis and having to defend that thesis and a certain number of pages or words. So that required more effort for me, because that's something I was not used to doing, you know, for for years. So I had to kind of develop that skill. But again, with engineering helping me to be able to put effort into something that's worthwhile, that helped me a lot with my philosophical studies. But I never got to practice electrical engineering. Never got to work as an engineer because I went from my master's degree straight into seminary. So, but I think the skills I learned there, perseverance and effort, played a huge role in my success. Thanks be to God, as a philosopher and theologian. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for spending time with us today. Our guest has been Father Dozy Ononuju, a newly ordained priest of the Catholic Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Thank you again, Father.
Thanks so much, Dr. Annadale. I appreciate it. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you for listening to Life After Philosophy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. I appreciate your support.